All right, welcome back to MetFlex and Chill. This is Rachel Greger, your host, and I'm here with Dr. Stephen Hussey. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Excited to dive into all things heart health today. We have a few, actually, we have a bunch of listener questions, and so I'm excited to dive into those. But before we get started, do you want to give our listeners just a little bit of an intro to who you are, what you do, all that stuff?
Yeah, of course. So I'm a chiropractor by training, and I also have a master's degree in human nutrition and functional medicine. And so I practice very traditional chiropractic in a clinic, very neuromusculoskeletal type ailments. But I've also done a lot of research into heart health, and I do health coaching and a lot of research in nutrition because of my own history, my own health history. And so that history is that from a very young age, I suffered with a lot of chronic conditions and ailments, very inflammatory in nature, lots of things like asthma and very bad allergies, and I had IBS, and I used to break out in chronic hives all over my body, and the doctors didn't even know why. And then ultimately I ended up with autoimmune type 1 diabetes. And so that has kind of threw me into the Western medical system, and I learned over time that that predisposed me to heart disease quite a bit, almost 4 times increased risk to heart disease. And so, as I got like medical training and did all my own personal research, anytime I saw heart disease, my ears perked up, and I just learned as much as I could, and just kind of devoted to preventing this illness I'm supposedly predisposed to having. And so I guess about maybe almost 2 years ago now, I started sharing this information that I had, and people seemed to respond pretty well. So I kept sharing it, and now, I'm kind of known for heart health and that kind of stuff.
Awesome, awesome. That's a really, really interesting story. I definitely want to dive into um, kind of, well, we will dive into all things heart health because a lot of the questions are around that, obviously, with our listeners. But before we dive into that, we were kind of talking offline how I found you through our friend Robert Sykes, and then I saw you post about metabolic flexibility. And obviously, that's what I'm very passionate about. That's what the show's named after. So do you want to kind of give us your view before we jump into the questions? Do you want to give us kind of your take on the benefits of being metabolically flexible, and kind of how, um, well, you mentioned metabolic. I'm forgetting. We were talking offline. What was the
Metabolic
word?
heart attacks.
Metabolic heart attack. So yeah, let's get into that because I'm super interested to learn about that. Yeah.
Yeah. Perfect. So yeah, I kind of found my way to, or I kind of caught the attention of like the low carb, metabolically flexible, like keto community, because I found in the research this benefit, I think, to the heart of having ketones around and being very metabolically flexible. So there's a lot of like background information to this, but I've come across a lot of information that shows that that a blockage or a stenosis of an artery or a clot or an embolism or whatever is not the only way that heart attacks can happen. And there's a lot of heart attacks where they do the autopsy and none of those things are present. And so I've actually had a lot of people come up to me and say, yeah, I had a heart attack and they found no blockage. And so I was like, oh, interesting. And so some of the information that I had previously and combined with these anecdotal things, I kind of started investigating this. I think it's very clear that we can get heart attacks with no blockage whatsoever. So the heart is a tissue that seems to prefer ketones over any other fuel source, and fatty acids as well. But there's studies that show that even in the presence of glucose, even when glucose is around, when sugar is around, for the muscle cells to burn, the heart muscle cells to burn, if you put ketones in there, the glucose utilization goes down up to 60% because the heart goes straight to the ketones every time. And so that's not the case necessarily in the rest of the body, because we know we have to restrict carbohydrates, especially processed carbohydrates, if we want the body to start taking fatty acids and making ketones. So we get into that metabolically flexible state, or ketogenic state, as it's called. But the heart seems to have this preference. And so I thought that was pretty interesting. And so when I look into that, I've also, as a chiropractor, I look into imbalances in the autonomic nervous system, because chiropractors treat the nervous system. It's thought that we treat, muscle pains and neck pain and back pain, and we do that, but we're really doing that through treating the nervous system. And then I also looked at, a lot of inflammation, which is, the root behind atherosclerosis and this kind of stuff, which I think we're going to talk about later. So those three things, those imbalances where we're metabolically inflexible, which means we're eating, a very processed food, standard American diet, and burning one fuel source, which is glucose or sugar, and having high inflammation or oxidative stress, which means that there's a lot of free radicals in your body, which I describe as like the Tasmanian devil, Looney Tunes Tasmanian devil, where he's going around and causing havoc on everything. Those are what those kind of are. And then we also have this imbalance in our autonomic nervous system. This has to do with our stress response. Okay. So I think that when we have those three imbalances, which are very common in our modern world, that can lead us to what I have kind of started calling metabolic heart attacks. So these are heart attacks so a heart attack is just tissue death or necrosis of heart tissue. And they can lead us to death of heart tissue through these imbalances. And so I'll try and piece them together and show you how that can happen. And I'll try and explain it as best I can. So basically, if we have those three imbalances, then but the thing that sets it off is a stressful event. And so, it's very common that heart attacks happen on the more stressful days of the year. And there's studies that show this. Mondays are very notorious heart attack days. And also, they've done studies in Europe that show that on their holidays or some of their major holidays, heart attacks are very stressful, which is unfortunate because they're holidays, but they tend to be stressful for people as well. Or like major sporting events tend to be stressful for some people, especially the gamblers, I'm sure. But these events are highly associated with more heart attacks. And so if we have these three imbalances and then we have this stressful event that happens, what that does is in our autonomic nervous system, it's supposed to be sending a stress and a non-stress signal to the heart at all times, and to the rest of the body really, but to the heart in this case. And it's supposed to be a balance signal. It's supposed to, like if we have a stressful event that happens, there's always supposed to be a lesser non-stress signal that balances it out. Now, the way that those two signals get to the heart and get into the heart cells is a little bit different. The stress signal goes right in, no issue. Whereas the non-stress signal, it needs what's called nitric oxide to get in. That's the kind of the gatekeeper that lets it in. And nitric oxide is the famous molecule made by our arteries that dilates your blood vessels, right? And so if we have oxidative stress, so we have high amounts of free radicals from excess toxins in our life, or poor diet, processed carbohydrate diet, or endotoxemia, different things, that can actually deplete nitric oxide. And so now we have this oxidative stress imbalance that's inhibiting nitric oxide. And so we have this stressful event, and we get this really stressful signal to the heart, and we don't get the lesser balancing signal, non-stress signal to the heart. And so what happens is the same kind of thing that happens if we go for a run in our leg muscles. So that's a stress, okay? And your body will send stress signals to your leg muscles to start burning more glucose, the glycogen stored in our muscles. And that leads to lactic acid and hydrogen ion buildup in our leg muscles. And that's what we call the muscle burn when we go for a run or we lift weights or something like that. And that's fine, because if that gets to be too bad or too painful, we can just stop exercising and the lactic acid gets pumped out within about an hour or so. And it stops building up and we stop feeling that burn. However, if that happens in heart tissue, the heart just can't stop beating. So we get this stress signal, and that triggers the heart it kind of forcefully triggers the heart to burn more glucose than it wants to. And remember, it prefers fatty acids and ketones, for this reason, to prevent it from making lactic acid. And so we get this buildup of lactic acid, and that creates a burn in our chest, which people call angina. And so it's thought that that's a restriction of blood flow and we lose oxygen. and that causes that, but it could also be caused this way as well. And so when that happens, when this lactic acid builds up, that can cause a swelling or an edema in the tissue, and that swelling changes the pressure. So usually the pressure is higher from the blood coming to the heart muscle. But now that there's pressure in the middle, because this lactic acid, now the pressure is more going out, and the blood can't get to the area. And without blood, we get tissue death. And it also, the lactic acid has also been shown to interfere with calcium, which calcium is how muscles contract. And so that kind of messes with the contractility of muscle tissue. But yeah, so if we have or if we are metabolically unflexible, we are more likely, when this situation happens, we're more likely to revert to burning glucose in our heart. Whereas if we have plenty of ketones and fatty acids around, it's less likely to happen. And that's also been shown in research that ketones and fatty acids, they cannot be fermented as fuel sources in our cells. They can only be used through oxidative phosphorylation. So it makes a lot of sense. And it kind of explains how someone could have a heart attack with no blockage present whatsoever. So that's one of the reasons I think that being metabolically flexible is extremely important. So I know that was just a lot, but I'll let you break it down or ask questions where you want to.
Yeah. I mean, it's super interesting just like learning about all this stuff. I feel like there's so many, I don't know, there's just so many misconceptions around like heart attacks and things like that. And, I'm no expert in heart attacks at all. So, but yeah, that's super interesting. So I guess kind of in the sense of like practicality, when we're talking about like becoming metabolically flexible, and this is actually one of the questions or one of the first questions that I have on my list. So it's kind of related. So maybe we can kind of just dive into this and maybe circle back to the metabolic heart attack and kind of practical ways to maybe prevent that hopefully.
Yeah, definitely.
So, when we, and a lot of people listening to this podcast are already, familiar with obviously low carb, keto, all of that, and kind of, the issues that we face with the quote unquote standard American diet. But when we do hear or we see in like the grocery store, like what a heart healthy diet consists of. So one of the questions is actually, what does a quote unquote heart healthy diet actually consist of? In your opinion, versus what the government might be slapping on cereal boxes or the American Heart Association, and can you kind of talk to that?
Yeah. So, I just went through that whole spiel there, and the conclusion was, metabolic flexibility is going to help us not have that situation happen. Mm-hmm. And so, I find it very problematic then that some of the foods that are recommended as heart healthy by American Heart Association, by American Medical Association, by government bodies and academic institutions, they're recommending foods that directly cause metabolic inflexibility. And some of those foods would be, whole grains or grains in general. Or I think the main culprit is probably vegetable oils. Those are probably the worst food for metabolic health because they literally break your metabolism in a way that makes your fat cells very insulin sensitive, which means they're going to take up a bunch of glucose and fat and store them, and then makes the rest of the body very insulin resistant. Which is, the classic metabolic inflexibility or poor metabolic health. And so the converse of that is, I think, a very heart healthy diet is actually one that consists of the things that we've been told are terrible for it, which is saturated fat and cholesterol. Animal fats, I think, are the best for the heart. And there's so many different reasons why. So if we look at just the saturated fats and how our body metabolizes those and how they create metabolic health through insulin resistant fat cells and insulin sensitive muscle cells in the rest of the body. That's one reason why. And everybody wants to talk about saturated and unsaturated fat. And that's one aspect of things. And saturated fat seems to be better for heart health and health in general. But the other part of it is that there's such a thing as comparing plant fats to animal fats. And so animal fats are cholesterol and plant fats are phytosterol. And lots of people don't know that there's this difference. They think they see coconut oil and that's just saturated fat. And that's right, it's saturated fat, just like lard or beef tallow or something. But it's got a lot of phytosterol versus cholesterol. So cholesterol is what animals use, or animals, and phytosterol is what plants use. And so there's some studies, and lots of them are done in rats, so we can't really take them at face value, but they're very interesting, and they show that plant fats are definitely worse for us than animal fats. I'm not ready to write off coconut oil or olive oil or anything like that, but I am ready to write off vegetable oils completely. But I think that most of our fat should be coming from animals. And there's actually one study done in humans where these people were scheduled to have a heart valve transplant and or replacement or whatever they call it. And before they did them, the transplants, they meticulously interviewed these people and asked them how much plant fat they were eating based on certain foods they were eating. And they found a direct correlation to the amount of phytosterol, plant fats, deposited in and around the valve they were replacing to how much these people reported eating. So kind of interesting. It almost suggests that the body can't use phytosterol that well, and it gets deposited in areas we don't want it to. So yeah, I think that we should definitely be focused on animal foods and animal fats, and not be afraid of saturated fat or cholesterol, and that's the most heart healthy diet is those foods.
Gotcha. Yeah. I mean, I agree. And I think it's something that, if we just look at, and it's with the vegetable oils, like if you just look at all of the, go in a grocery store and look at all of the packaged foods and all of that, like we know, cereal and all that stuff is not great for us, but a lot of people tend to look at like the carbohydrate content of the cereal and the high sugar content of the cereal. And then also like all the other packaged foods, like you're just immediately looking at the sugar and the carb content. But I think that's one of the issues, especially in like the low carb space and keto space as well, is that we need to look a step further and look to see like what types of, fats are being used, or vegetable oils or whatever, because that is, a very, like you just talked about, it's very important as well. It's not just like the carbs and the sugar and the processed food, but it's also like, okay, let's go a step further and see like what else is in this. And also, when we're talking about vegetable oils, if you're someone who is, eating out at restaurants constantly and you're not aware of, you're like, oh yeah, this is, even if you like, for example, pick a quote unquote low carb dish, right? Like a chicken with vegetables, that's, depending on what restaurant you go, it's probably cooked in all vegetable oil. And so it's like, you think that you are choosing a healthy choice, right? It's a low carb, option. Not that all low carb options are healthy, right? But it's just, I think it's one of those things that we just need to become more aware of, and especially in like restaurants and just packaged foods and all that. So I don't know, that's just something that I've been becoming more aware of myself, and kind of teaching some of the clients that I work with to just, practice awareness around these things, because no one's going to, like, especially in the restaurants, like they're not going to tell you.
Definitely.
Right. Because obviously cooking with olive oil and butter and saturated fats and things like that is obviously a lot more expensive than using, vegetable oil. So I don't know, that's just something that I get frustrated about.
Yeah. And I think that people don't even realize either that, like way back in the 1950s, when this whole war on fat started with Ansel Keys and his bad research, that they actually did a lot of studies on saturated fat versus polyunsaturated fat. So vegetable oils are polyunsaturated fat, and saturated fats are, the animal foods, and then even things like coconut oil and those things. So, but they did a lot of these studies, and there was one, there was one in Australia, the Sydney Diet Heart Study or something, and there was one Minnesota Coronary Study. There was one in Finland, and they did all these studies that directly compared the consumption of these and the health outcomes of these people. And every single one of them found that the more polyunsaturated fat that people ate, the more unhealthy they were, the more heart disease they got, the more all-cause mortality there was. And curiously, lots of those studies didn't get published until many, many years later, and they got published in small journals that nobody really reads that much. And then there's a guy named Christopher Ramsden who went back and found the data and then published these studies and found more data than that was actually published the first time. And he interviewed one of the lead authors in one of the studies, and they said, "Why didn't you publish this stuff?" And he said, "We didn't get the result we wanted. So it just wasn't published." And the whole theory of unsaturated fat being better for us than saturated fat was already in full swing when this happened. And so they just kind of ran with it. And so it's just very interesting. But it's curious, though, that one of the reasons that polyunsaturated fat is touted as being better for us is because it lowers cholesterol. And it does that because, like I was mentioning, phytosterol versus cholesterol, and they compete with each other for absorption. So if we eat both at the same time, then they're going to compete in the digestive system to be absorbed. And so if we eat a lot of plant fat, then we're going to absorb less animal fat, which is cholesterol. And so that can lower your cholesterol. So that's why things like, margarine are touted as being heart healthy, because they lower cholesterol. But then we find out that lowering cholesterol may not be the best strategy, and now they're not heart healthy, and they were actually leading to poorer health outcomes. So yeah, the whole vegetable oil thing is just, it's really problematic, and it's really important to be aware in your environment where those foods are, so you know you're avoiding them.
Yeah, for sure. And I definitely want to get into the cholesterol piece of things, because I have a bunch of questions here. So first of all, can we just generally talk about why, striving to lower your cholesterol might not be the best choice in general, and it kind of goes against all the things that we've learned over the last 20 years. Can we just maybe, I don't know, it's a really broad question, but maybe you can just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, it started back in the 1950s when heart disease was relatively not like a new thing, but it was a growing problem. It was starting to become a real issue because people were being diagnosed left and right. And even President Eisenhower had a heart attack, and everybody was freaking out about heart disease. And so the people wanted an answer. And there was one scientist named Ansel Keys who came up with an answer. And we know that this answer was wrong, but it was an answer, and people kind of rode with it, I guess. And who knows what else was going on and whatever, but I just know that it happened. And so, the idea was that he was observing in places that people who ate, more unsaturated fat tended to have less heart disease, and people who ate more saturated fat tended to have more heart disease. But there's a huge issue with the type of research that this was. And this is called epidemiology research. It's called observational research. And so the problem with that is that these types of studies can only show associations, which means two things are happening at the same time, but they cannot show that one causes the other. And this is the lowest form of research there is, because these types of studies are really designed to allow us to make hypotheses. Okay, we see these things are associated. Now let's test and see if one actually does cause the other. And so the example I give a lot is if we're standing on the side of the street and we see a traffic jam, and we also see that it's cloudy, we can't say that the traffic jam caused the clouds or that the clouds caused the traffic jam. We can say that they're associated because they're happening at the same time, but we can't say that they cause each other. And so that was what the whole idea that saturated fat and cholesterol is bad for us came from those types of studies. And they never should have been made into recommendations until they were tested. And so they actually were tested when they did these studies I was talking about, but then the research wasn't published. So it throws a lot of questions into why that was, and was there financial interest or whatever. But cholesterol is essential for human health. It's essential for any animal's health. That's why it's there. And so to me, in my head, it makes no sense that if there's something that's essential for us to be there, that it could be causing disease. And then people will say, Well, yeah, but if it gets too high, then it becomes an issue. And I haven't seen any evidence that directly shows that high cholesterol, or that an LDL molecule, which is the quote unquote bad cholesterol in LDL, can directly cause atherosclerosis or damage the lining of an artery, and then get deposited in it, that it can actually cause that to happen. It only happens if there's things that predispose us, or that a previous situation that happens, which is inflammation and damage. But if we want to talk about the benefits of cholesterol, it's necessary for the transportation of energy. Well, the LDL molecules are responsible for the transportation of energy, and those are filled with cholesterol. It's responsible for transporting fat-soluble vitamins, which are critical for our health, vitamins A, D, E, and K. Our brain is a huge percentage cholesterol. So if we want a high-functioning brain, then we want lots of cholesterol. But also, just the process of the body making cholesterol from a fatty acid, there's lots of intermediate molecules in that process that the body uses for very important things. One of them being dolicol, which is very important for the health of insulin receptors. And so this is why statin drugs that lower cholesterol and prevent the production of cholesterol have been shown to cause diabetes, because we're not getting enough of this molecule dolicol, and then that's not allowing our insulin receptors to function, and we get insulin resistance, which is diabetes. Mm-hmm. And then also there's other molecules that are that our body uses to make our own antioxidants, like glutathione and superoxide dismutase, which are very important for detoxification and getting rid of inflammation and free radicals. And so if we don't have these molecules that are derivatives of cholesterol, then we don't have those things. But also all of our hormones, especially our sex hormones, are made from cholesterol. Vitamin D is made from cholesterol. So if we don't have enough of that, doesn't matter how much sunlight we're going to get, we're not going to make enough. So there's all these different benefits. So it makes no sense that it would be bad for us, in my opinion. And then, there's two studies, and these are associational studies. These are epidemiology studies, just like Ansel Keys did. But you would think that if cholesterol was so bad for us, then the people in these studies with the higher cholesterol would have worse health outcomes, right? And however, there's these two studies, one called the Leiden 85 plus study, and one's called the Lothian birth cohort study. And they just tracked people, one study, they tracked them, from birth till death. There were all these people born in 1936, and they tracked them. And then another one was, they tracked people over 85 in Holland. And they found that those people with the highest cholesterol also had the lowest rates of infection, the lowest or the highest cognitive abilities, the lowest rates of heart disease, lowest rates of cancer, and lowest all-cause mortality. And so again, these are associational studies. We can't prove that high cholesterol prevents or gives us those health benefits. But what we can say is that if it was so bad, we would expect the people with higher cholesterol to have more disease. And that's not what they showed.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just like standing here, like shaking my head. It's so like interesting, but it's also just like so messed up, you know, because everybody's just like, at least I grew up like thinking, cholesterol is bad. Like you should have, low cholesterol. And that was, the biggest thing to focus on. So, and it's still like that. I work with a lot of clients, and we have some questions here too, related to kind of LDL and HDL, which I want to jump into, but I just I don't know. It frustrates me because a lot of doctors are still, and I'm not an expert on cholesterol at all, but just everything you're saying is a lot of the stuff that I've, read and researched as well. And it's just kind of disheartening that, oh, that's a good word to use in this podcast. Anyway.
Nice.
Disheartening. Yeah, right. I didn't even think about it. That doctors are not like up to the current research, right? And it's just so disheartening. And I'm just going to leave it at that before I continue to ramble on about this. But we do have a few questions that are related to this. So I want to jump into those. So someone said, I feel, and you probably did talk about a few of these already, but we'll just jump into them and see if we can, pull a few more things out. But someone said, I feel great eating tons of animal protein and low carb, but now my cholesterol is high. My doctor is worried. Should I worry?
Right. Yeah. And so nothing I say is medical advice,
Mm-hmm.
but I'll give you my opinion. And I also want to say, because you say, I'm not an expert. Well, guess what? Neither am I.
Mm.
I have chiropractic training, and this is just all my own, interest and passions and, my own health journey and just what I found.
Yeah.
So people can take that for what it is. Some people don't want to hear stuff about the heart from a chiropractor, but, I feel like they're going to miss out, I guess. But yeah. So this happens a lot. And so, Dave Feldman has labeled these people lean mass hyperresponders. And I think they're way more common than we think. And I before we talk about like what I would look for on a blood work panel to make me worry or not worry about that, I want to say that blood work is something that I believe will never tell you if you're healthy or not, or unhealthy or not. It's a tool that is used to kind of figure out what to do for someone's health. It can tell you if there's something really wrong, so does play a role and it is important. But I don't think it will ever tell me whether I'm healthy or not. And I don't think that going based off what a blood work panel says should dictate whether you are healthy or not. And sometimes that's confusing to people, but I think that we put way too much emphasis on that. And so the reason is that, the quote unquote normal values that we find for lab work, they vary from lab to lab based on their normal ranges, but also they are the normal values are determined based on a population that we know is not living the way that humans should. So if you look at how relatively new testing for blood work is, and then you look at what humans would have been eating when we were outside of civilization, over 10,000 years ago, how do we know what blood work looked like when we were living in nature, eating our natural diet? We just don't.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I think, a more species appropriate diet of higher animal foods, when someone starts eating that and they see cholesterol go up, is that pathologic? Or is that just something that we've labeled pathologic because we didn't see it before? Or is that normal? And it's just that person's returned to their normal or species appropriate diet. I don't know the answer, but those are interesting things to think about. And so when I look at a blood work panel, I can tell you that, like I said, in those studies, the associational studies, people with higher cholesterol, and I don't mean just normal cholesterol, I mean like higher, had those benefits. And so I think that higher cholesterol is okay and can provide us with benefits. And I have two personal ones. One is that because my cholesterol is also very high according to the standards. And one of them was that I felt that since I'm type 1 diabetic and I give myself insulin, that my insulin was more responsive. And I was able to use less. And I chalk that up to, having that molecule that makes my insulin receptors healthy, more cholesterol around to make that molecule. But also, I knock on wood, but I haven't been sick since 2016. I sometimes I'll feel like a little thing in your throat, or you feel it kind of in your ear, and then it never turns into anything. And one benefit of cholesterol is that it's been shown to help fight infection. And so when I have these high levels of cholesterol around, I think that it's helping me do that. These are just anecdotal stories. I can't prove anything, but these are things I've noticed. And that's something we do hear a lot in people who have higher cholesterol who go on low carb or animal-based diets. They say a lot that they stop getting sick as much, or they don't get sick at all. And so when I look at a blood work panel, like a lipid panel specifically, where you're looking at your cholesterol numbers, I don't really care what total cholesterol is, as long as it's high enough. And I don't really care what LDL is, as long as it's high enough. As long as the HDLs are, either in the normal range or high, on the higher end, and the triglycerides are very low. And by very low, I mean probably less than 100 or lower.
Okay.
And so that's kind of like what I look for there. But then I also want to see very low markers of inflammation, which is not on a lipid panel. I want to see low, high sensitivity C-reactive protein. I want to see low homocysteine if it's taken, or low GGT, which is a liver enzyme that can test for or give us an indication of oxidative stress. Yeah, there's a bunch of different inflammatory markers that people could look at to take, but I want to see that those general inflammation markers are low. We have low levels of inflammation and oxidative stress. And if that's the case, then I'm not too worried about cholesterol levels, and I think that higher can be beneficial. And even if inflammation is higher, I'm not convinced that cholesterol is bad, or it's the bad guy here. I think that it gets framed a lot of times because it shows up at the scene of the crime, but I don't think that it's the cause. But I can't say that for certain yet. It just doesn't make sense to me based on what I've found.
Yeah. Again, super interesting stuff. And like what you said about the different ranges, like what's, what is normal, right? Like we don't know. So
yeah, I
that in
think it's
itself
interesting
is
too that they've changed the normal. They keep lowering it. They keep saying that it needs to be lower, and I feel like that's because they want to give more statin drugs because they're very profitable, and so they lower the ranges, then more people are out of range and they can give more drugs. So yeah, it's just interesting.
yeah, it's crazy stuff.
Mhm.
So so another question related to this, which you might have already touched on, but they said, should you worry about high LDL if you have low triglycerides and high HDL and big fluffy particles?
Mm. So no. I mean, short answer is no. But I actually wrote a blog on this not too long ago about why I don't think that particle size is even really that important. It definitely gives us an indication of if you are in a high inflammatory or oxidative stress state, because when we are, then those cholesterol molecules become damaged and they get smaller. So they're not big and fluffy, they're small and dense, right? So that can tell us, be an indicator that we have a problem with oxidative stress. But I still don't think that there's anything that I've seen that proves that small, dense, damaged, oxidized LDL is going to get into the lining of an artery and cause an issue. And the reason is that this is going into a whole other topic here. But so one thing that people very rarely know is that there's something called fourth phase water. And it's exactly what it sounds like. Water is, we know, 3 phases: solid, liquid, gas. There's actually a 4th phase of water that it can get into. And it's called structured water or exclusion zone water. And it happens when water has energy applied to it, usually in the form of infrared light, like from the sun. But when water has energy applied to it and it's next to a hydrophilic surface, a water-loving surface. And so, and guess what the lining of our arteries are? A water-loving surface. And guess what half of our blood is? Water. And so this phenomenon happens in the arteries. And so the reason that one of the nicknames of this water is exclusion zone water is because when it forms and it packs itself up against the lining of an artery in the tube, it excludes anything that's not it, which means that it kind of acts as a barrier to the lining of our arteries. And so if we have healthy 4th phase water, exclusion zone water in our arteries, which we can talk about how we can do that, but we have that, then nothing can really get through. The only things that can get through are very small ionic minerals, I guess hydrated ionic minerals. And so the researcher who has looked into all this 4th phase water stuff and proven that it occurs in arteries is named Gerald Pollack, and he has found that the protein albumin cannot get through this barrier. And that's significant because protein albumin is like the smallest protein that floats around in our blood. And so that's like, I believe it's like 2.5 nanometers, it's protein albumin. And LDL molecules, even if they're damaged, even HDL molecules, which are the smallest ones, are way bigger than that. So there's no way they're going to get through. and go and destroy the artery if we have this layer there. And the thing that destroys that layer is what we've been talking about, is oxidative stress, is free radicals, is inflammation. And so the same things that cause the damage to the particles, the LDL cholesterol particles, is the same thing that damages the lining of the artery. So it's like it's all happening at the same time. So we may see atherosclerosis more associated with damaged LDL particles, but that's because there's oxidative stress causing both of those things. It's not the LDL causing the atherosclerosis, right? And so when that stuff damages this fourth phase water, then it destroys it, and then it gets to the lining of the artery and then damages that, and the body has to respond in some way. And that is usually using, cholesterol and minerals like calcium as spackle, basically, and patching up the damaged areas. So yeah, that was the long answer to the particle size question. But yeah.
Huh. And you said you wrote a blog post on that?
Yeah, it's called, I think something like why LDL particle size may not matter or something like that.
Okay. I'll definitely link that in the show notes in case anybody wants to dive a little bit deeper into that. And you talk about the fourth phase water as well.
I do. And I talk about that in multiple blog posts, but I talk about it in that one as well.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'll definitely link that. I'm sure I'm going to definitely check it out because I'm a nerd and I know there's other nerds who listen to this podcast. So
good. Nerds are good.
Yeah. Okay. So this is actually related to what you were talking about a little bit just now with inflammation. So someone said, is inflammation the primary cause of heart disease? And is all inflammation bad?
Yes, I think so. And I think I talked about that, a little bit just now, but we'll go into what causes inflammation. And then, is all inflammation bad? No. But in the amounts that we're seeing in the population today, yes. So we're meant to have a little bit of oxidative stress. Our bodies make free radicals every time that we burn something for energy. The problem is when we have external things coming in contact with our body or getting into our body that contribute to oxidative stress, or we're creating a lot of oxidative stress through the metabolic pathway that we're telling our body to use, like lots more glucose rather than ketones and fatty acids. And so when that happens and our body can't take care of those free radicals, because these free radicals, they do important things. They signal different things to the body. They tell it what to do and how to react based on the environment we're in. But when we get in this state, so that would be the inflammation that's good, or if you get sick and your body mounts a fever, that's inflammation. We want that. That's your body responding to that virus or that bacteria or whatever. If we sprain our ankle, we want inflammation to happen because that's healing. That's how the body goes and heals that area, right? But if we get this state where we have too many of these free radicals, the Looney Tunes Tasmanian devil, running around, and we don't have enough antioxidants to help combat those free radicals, then we get what's called oxidative stress. We get into a state of imbalanced oxidative stress, and that's what causes the inflammation that I think damages the fourth phase water and then damages the artery. And so there are a lot of things that can cause or contribute to oxidative stress. And I think that most of the time, and most people, it's a combination. It's not just one thing or another. And so the list is, I think, being metabolically inflexible. So we're burning more glucose in our cells and less ketones and fatty acids. And research has shown that burning glucose results in more free radical production. And so I think that being so dependent on that metabolic pathway and just burning that fuel source is not a problem. It's not that carbs are evil or bad, and we should be able to burn them. We should be able to go back and forth burning them just fine. But it's when we only do that we can get in trouble. And so that's one. Number two is toxins from our environment. So we are surrounded by so many, different toxins that our bodies are not used to, that have come on the scene very quickly. There's no way we could have adapted to those toxins. Everything from heavy metals like aluminum and mercury and lead and arsenic and those types of things, to plastics and phthalates and all kinds of stuff like that. And there's just so many different toxins, herbicides and pesticides, so many different things that contribute to oxidative stress in our bodies. And lots of those things don't necessarily act like free radicals themselves, but when they get in the body, they seem to create free radicals. So that results in more oxidative stress. Another one is what we call advanced glycation end products. And all that means is damaged by sugar. So that can come in the form of heating food or burning food. So like the crust of bread is a notorious advanced glycation end product, or charring the meat. When you burn it too much. It's not to say that we should never grill our meat. It's just to say that if you overcook it, then it's going to have more free radicals, more things that cause free radical damage. But also elevated blood sugars. So this is the one thing I learned very early. It was that because I was asking doctors, why is type 1 diabetics so prone to heart disease and having bad eyes and losing a kidney and that kind of stuff. And it's because of vascular damage from damage to cells by extra or excess sugar in the blood. Because no matter how hard I try, my blood sugars will never be as normal as the insulin sensitive, healthy non-diabetic. I try really hard, and it's way better than most type 1 diabetics, I feel like, but they'll never be the same. So just fluctuations in blood sugar, ups and downs in blood sugars can cause those things. And then one that a lot of people don't know about or hear about a lot is endotoxemia, which is basically the presence of bacteria, gram-negative bacteria in our bloodstream that shouldn't be there really. The main source of this is when bacteria from our gut, when we have leaky gut, leaks into the bloodstream. But the other source of this is when we have poor dental health. So when we have gingivitis, or we have root canals, or we have teeth that have been pulled and weren't cleaned out properly, there's a lot of potential for bacteria to stay in the mouth and fester in the sockets and everything in different places and then leak into the bloodstream. And so endotoxemia has definitely been shown to cause oxidative stress and inflammation. So those are, some of the sources of the inflammation that I think is driving atherosclerosis and damage to the lining of arteries and damage to fourth phase water. And it's interesting because people, we're told it's all about diet, when we're so focused on LDL and cholesterol. And so, but that is not the only thing that can cause atherosclerosis. And when you look at the research, it's crazy. All these things have been either highly associated or directly shown to cause atherosclerosis. So, yeah.
Just crazy. I'm learning so much, and it's just like
good.
It's crazy to me, but
yeah, scary sometimes.
Yeah, scary. Yeah. So I guess, if someone's listening to this and they just heard all that and they're like, oh, well, I've been so focused on my diet. What's like your kind of top 3 things that you would focus on besides diet, maybe?
Yeah. Just good. I think that because lots of times you can't control these things, like to have or to find a dentist who knows what they're doing. It can go in there and clean out your mouth and do it the way that it needs to be, can be hard to find, but then also very expensive to do. So sometimes that's not realistic for people. But I think that one thing people can start doing today or tomorrow or whenever is becoming aware of the amount of toxins in their environment, like their personal environment, and limiting those wherever they can. And then not freaking out about the ones you can't control, because you can't control everything. Yeah. And so just, always be taking steps to get to a place where you can control more of the toxins. But, if that means getting a less toxic toothpaste, that's what it means. If it means replacing your, aluminum pots and pans, your Teflon pots and pans with something less toxic, then that's what it means, and it's just going through every aspect of your life, cleaning products, your cosmetics, all kinds of stuff, and just replacing them with the least toxic things possible. And then, looking at air quality, like where do you live? How's the air quality there? Can you move? Can you filter the air in your bedroom while you're sleeping? All this kind of stuff. There's all kinds of ways you can start to decrease your toxin exposure and reduce oxidative stress. So that's one. I think stable blood sugars are huge. And so eating a diet that that creates stable blood sugars, so eating foods, making fatty acids the main fuel sources you use. Doesn't mean you can't have carbs ever, but definitely not processed carbs, and stick to whole foods. That's what's going to create stable blood sugars, because that's going to be have a huge impact on inflammation and oxidative stress. And then the third one, the third most important thing.
I put you on the spot here.
I think interestingly, I think that controlling or managing our stress is very, very important, because when we're stressed out all the time, that's going to increase metabolism. And if we have imbalances in our metabolism, that's just going to exacerbate those. And like we were talking about before, I think that the imbalance in that stress response is a huge trigger in these metabolic heart attacks. It's kind of like the thing that sets it all off. It sets it into motion. So yeah, and that's, that's a topic that I also feel like is overlooked with heart disease. I mean, there's a reason we say, I love you with all my heart, or we gave it all our heart. It's because our heart is incredibly attached to our emotional state. And if we ignore that connection, and if we don't take care of that aspect of our lives, then our heart is feeling the repercussions for sure.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's one of the biggest things that I work with a lot of women. I have a lot of clients, one-on-one clients, and also in my programs that come to me for, fat loss or to build more muscle and things like that. And one of the biggest things that we focus on is implementing stress management techniques throughout their life, and all these kind of little things that we start to work on that's outside of the nutrition, outside of the training. And those are the things that when we start to focus on those, everything else starts to fall into place. And I think that's one of the most overlooked things is stress management and self-care and all of that. And I know for myself, until I started paying attention to that, nothing changed. And when I started, implementing a morning routine, doing meditation practice and things like that, which I used to always think was didn't matter, right? It was that's a waste of time, right? I have other stuff to worry about. But when I started doing that, that's when everything changed. And I feel like I've never had a client who hasn't felt the same way. So yeah, I totally agree with that.
Yeah, definitely. It's so important.
Yeah, for sure. So, okay, we're getting a little, we're about an hour now. So we have one more question, and it doesn't have anything to do with cholesterol inflammation, but it's interesting. And this is a question actually from one of the members who's in my Keto for Women program right now. But she asked about caffeine. So she said, is caffeine bad for your heart? For example, does the increase in heart rate harm the heart?
So I don't know if a yes or no is appropriate here. I think that it depends on the person, because if you've got somebody who has got control over their stress response, their heart rate variability is very healthy, which is the best measure of our autonomic nervous system that we have, and their mineral status is okay, and they're generally healthy. I think that we'll be able to tolerate caffeine, and yes, it's a stimulant, and so it's going to increase your heart rate and your blood pressure temporarily. But ultimately, I think that health can be defined as the ability of your body to adapt to a new situation and then return to homeostasis. And so if we've got a healthy person and they do something like caffeine, even if it's a lot of it and it has an effect on their body and then they return to homeostasis, then I think that's fine. But if we've got someone who is, chronically stressed out and living an unhealthy lifestyle, and they're doing a lot of caffeine, mainly because they feel like they need it to keep going, then that's just fuel to the fire of the imbalances that they have. I don't, partake in caffeine of any sort. I used to do a lot of tea and stuff. But I don't feel that it's inherently bad for us, but it's not something that's necessary for health either. I think that we often get caught up in, like coffee has all these polyphenols and green tea has all these antioxidants, and people don't realize that polyphenols and antioxidants have never been shown to decrease oxidative stress. And so if we talk about that, and then because people say, oh, it has all these healthy things in it, then that small amount of caffeine can't be bad for us. And well, those things that are quote unquote so good for us haven't really been shown to be that great. Doesn't mean they're harmful. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. But I think there's a lot of things that we've been told as far as, or there's a lot of conventional wisdom that's been more a result of marketing than actual research or health outcomes. Not that I think research is the end all be all, but yeah. So I don't know if I kind of dodged around that question, but I think that it's okay in small amounts if you don't feel like it's contributing to negative health. Like if you're not already completely unhealthy, if you can take on that stress, I guess, and return to homeostasis relatively normally, then I don't see an issue with it.
Yeah, I agree. It comes back to that overall stress and the allostatic load, and all of that. So actually, I do have one more question because you mentioned HRV, and someone did ask about HRV, which I totally skipped over, my fault. But they said, my Apple, so this will be the last question. My Apple Watch gives an HRV, but I don't know what a good number is or why it varies.
Yeah.
So maybe you can just chat about HRV a little bit.
Well, it varies, supposedly, because different days bring on different stress. Your stress responses. So people they want things in black and white. So we think of our stress response, we think of our autonomic nervous system, we think of sympathetic and parasympathetic. Sympathetic is the stress state, and parasympathetic is a non-stress state. And we like to think of it, oh, we're in one or the other, but that's not really how it is. We need a balance between the two. Just like in the heart, we want a balanced signal, right? And so heart rate variability really is measuring our balance between the two. And so there's even heart rate variability monitors that report, oh, you're more in sympathetic, you're more in parasympathetic. And that's accurate. You're leaning more toward one or the other, but I don't like that it polarizes things and makes people think, oh, I'm in one or the other, because you're always getting signals from both. But heart rate variability is, people think it has to do with like the heart rate number, but in reality, so if I was to take my pulse on my wrist and take a deep breath in, and I would feel my pulse quicken, and that's stimulating sympathetic. When I breathe in, I'm stimulating sympathetic. And then when I breathe out, I would feel my pulse slow. And so the difference between, this is how I explain to people, the difference between the fastest it gets when you breathe in and the slowest it gets when you breathe out is your heart rate variability. And so that measures your ability to go back and forth between sympathetic, parasympathetic, or have, more of a signal, even though you're getting both from parasympathetic or sympathetic, as you breathe in and out. And so health would be a higher number. There's more variability. So you can go further into sympathetic, further into parasympathetic, and always come back, right? Whereas if you've got a very low heart rate variability, you can't go very far into either. So your ability to adapt is not very good. You can't, deal with the stressful situation very well. So as far as like what numbers are best, there's really no, they go anywhere from like 20 to 100 as far as normal goes. And so the best thing I tell people to do is get your heart rate variability number, like test it somehow and find that number that's kind of like your baseline, and then work to improve it from there. But don't compare it to other people's, or don't say it has to be this to be healthy. Again, I don't think any amount of testing can tell you whether you're healthy or not. These are just things we use as guidelines to see how we can change our environment to create better health. So yeah, I hope that explains heart rate variability.
No, yeah, that was probably the best way I've heard it explained. So awesome. Sweet. All right. Well, that was fun. I learned a lot. Thank you so much for taking time. Do you want to tell our listeners kind of where they can find you on social media, your website, all that stuff?
Yeah. My website is resourceyourhealth.com, and that's where I do like my health coaching and my blog. And then my books are on there. Well, I really have one book and then a small ebook. But my first book is The Health Evolution. My second book is in the works. It's getting close. So I'm hoping that by the end of the year, I'll be impressed with myself if it comes out before then. But yeah, that's going to be all about the heart. So a lot of the things we've been talking about, that's what that's going to be about. And then I'm on social media a little bit reluctantly, but I'm on social media at Dr. Stephen Hussey, Dr. Stephen Hussey on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. So yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, I'll definitely link all of that in the show notes. And then I'll also link to the blog that we mentioned. I'm going to go read that after we get off here and nerd out. But thank you so much again for taking the time. I'm excited for everybody to kind of hear this and, you know, take away the information that we talked about and hopefully kind of go off and do their own research, especially in regards to cholesterol and kind of all the things that we mentioned. Really just comes back to like the awareness piece of it, right? The more you are aware of these things, obviously nothing's going to be perfect, especially like with our environment and all of that. We can't, you know, control everything, but I love what you said about, you know, control the things you can control, and kind of do your best with that. And I guess that's the best you can do, right?
Yeah. Thanks for having me. It's great conversation. Pleasure being here.
Yeah, for sure. All right. I'll talk to you soon.
All right. See ya.
Bye.